Hello, and welcome to Talkin' Tales, where we share stories about our animal companions, their unique personalities, their zany antics, and the heartbreak of saying goodbye. I'm your host, Paul Barnett. In late summer of 2019, a local family that had two young ferrets moved out of their apartment and left the ferrets alone in a cage with food and water that ran out after a couple of days. They didn't tell anyone that the ferrets were there. Thankfully, after a few days, the landlord entered the apartment, discovered the ferrets, and got them to a shelter where they were nursed back to health. I adopted those ferrets on August 24th, 2019. Their names were Ludo and Dennis. Ludo was about 5 months old at the time, and Dennis was about 7 months old. This is their story. Dennis was an average-sized sable ferret with a distinctive dark square on the left side of his nose. He was gentle but playful, and quickly became friends with many of his new brothers and sisters. He would lead his siblings on fun adventures, such as getting them to follow him through a bouncy tube I had set up. He was happy to participate in a friendly wrestling match with one of his siblings, but generally didn't initiate them. At the start of playtime, Dennis would often seek me out for a bit of attention, be it a tummy rub or a cuddle, before dashing off to play with his siblings. Dennis would sometimes sleep in extra silly positions. For example, one evening I found him sleeping flat on his back with his paws lifted out in front of him. Had he been vertical, he could have been a mummy or a zombie. Once he was laying in a round bed, or rather half of his body was in the bed, with the other half, the upper half, out on the platform, with his paws up near his chin. To this human, it looked like it would be uncomfortable. But then again, many ferret sleeping positions look that way to humans. One time, I snapped a picture of Dennis sharing a barrel with his big brother Seven. Dennis had his tail curled and sitting on Seven's head, such that it looked like Seven was wearing a hairpiece. Dennis was one of three similar-looking sable boys I had at the time, the other two being Brendan and Omni. Thankfully, the mark on Dennis's nose helped distinguish him from the others. Omni has a white bib, which also helped, when I could see below his chin. Rigby looked similar to all of them, but his nose was fully dark, so it was easy to tell him apart from the others at just a glance. Personality-wise, it was always easy to tell them apart. Dennis was always the laid-back one, happy for a snuggle, and not causing even the least bit of trouble. Dennis was one of those rare ferrets who not only knew his name, but would come running when you called him. When I mentioned this to my vet, she seemed skeptical at first, but at one point when I was not in the room, she called for Dennis, and he poked his head up from under a blanket and looked at her. Dennis was a happy, active ferret for several years. He had been put on a small dose of prednisone to help control coughing that he had been experiencing. In mid-March of 2024, Dennis was not his usual happy, playful self. He acted tired. He was eating well, but was drinking more than usual. While he wasn't one to groom anyone, I followed the hairball protocol and gave him Vaseline, as well as gas drops and Pepsid. His behavior and lack of obvious symptoms reminded me of what I had observed with his big brother Bowie, who had passed away several months earlier, very unexpectedly. I checked Dennis's blood glucose to be sure it wasn't a crash, but that was normal. I watched Dennis closely and contacted his doctor. Dennis had not improved the following morning, so I took him to an emergency vet appointment. The doctors ran many tests throughout the day, but had no definitive diagnosis. An ultrasound showed masses suggestive of lymphoma. Dennis was now having trouble breathing if on his back, which made better imaging difficult. They were able to get a sample of one of the masses for analysis, however. On my vet's recommendation, I took Dennis to another clinic that was able to do a CT scan. Dennis was continuing to have trouble breathing, and according to his doctor, was using less than half of his lungs. There was inflammatory fluid buildup, and the doctor was concerned that if it was lymphoma, it was not a typical lymphoma and could be ferret systemic coronavirus, which thankfully was not transmissible, but there also wasn't an approved treatment for it for ferrets. We were developing a plan to treat possible lymphoma, which would require surgery, and the doctor wanted to extract some fluid from Dennis's chest so he could breathe easier. Dennis had been back home for a couple of days while we awaited lab results, but his doctor wanted to do a procedure on him later that week. I took Dennis in, and they prepared him for IV fluids. I was asked to bring a couple of his larger, healthier brothers for possible blood transfusions, which the doctor performed. She also gave him a chemotherapy dose and kept Dennis overnight for observation. The following morning, Dennis was very weak and not eating on his own, but not resisting being syringe-fed. As a set of lab results came in, it was determined that he was strong enough for a dose of a different chemotherapy agent, which the doctor administered. He showed small signs of improvement throughout the day, but not the significant improvement we were hoping for. We were now starting to discuss what was best for Dennis, if he could recover from this, or if we were no longer being fair to him. Before I made that decision, however, Dennis's body made the decision for us. Dennis passed away around 8 a.m. on March 24th, 2024. Ludo initially still looked like a baby, small to average size with a baby face. His ordeal without food may have contributed to him eating a lot of food, and he quickly grew and grew and grew to become one of my largest ferrets, weighing nearly 1,800 grams one winter, and hovering between 1,300 and 1,600 grams most of the rest of the year. I nicknamed him Big Floof. Ludo was playful and silly. He enjoyed wrestling with his brothers. He would also pal around my largest dog, Murphy. They both shared a love of food and had similar personalities, although Murphy was easily 10 times bigger. Ludo would sit beside Murphy, or just walk up to him and stare. He'd also walk up to a cat on occasion. He was fearless and harmless. Ludo made many friends, but quickly made one very good friend in Skeeter. In fact, the two of them would hang around together constantly, follow each other, wrestle with each other, snuggle up with each other, share soupies, and initiate play with each other and with their siblings. It was obvious they weren't just friends, they were best friends. Skeeter was technically Ludo's big brother by a few months, but Ludo was physically several hundred grams larger than Skeeter. Like Skeeter, Ludo would alternate between ferret cages. His sisters, including Sprinkles, Rhea, and Illyria, loved using him as a pillow when he slept in their cage, and his brothers, including Bowie, Seven, Benson, and Xerxes, enjoyed the extra warmth when he squeezed into a barrel or hammock with them. A few months after Ludo joined my family, another similar-looking, though initially smaller, ferret named Toberius joined my family. Toberius would also grow rather large, and at some points be as big as or bigger than Ludo. With just a casual glance, it could be hard to tell them apart, especially when Ludo's fur would get lighter and Toberius's fur would get darker. Most evenings, I put out at least a few tubes for the ferrets to run through. The tubes are actually high-quality dust collection hoses, and I initially used the 4-inch diameter versions. Ludo and Toberius were the reason I added some 6-inch diameter versions. They simply didn't fit into the 4-inch ones. When Skeeter passed unexpectedly in October of 2024, I worried how Ludo would handle it. The two had been inseparable for a little more than 5 years. Ludo made it through that, but his body was hiding a secret. He had a cyst on his liver. Normally, these aren't too problematic, But on April 2nd, 2025, when I gave morning medications to those ferrets who needed it, I made multiple trips to the cage that Ludo was sleeping in that day. On my second trip to the cage, I noticed that Ludo was in the exact same position that he was in when I was there a short while earlier. This isn't unheard of, but with the activity, there's usually some amount of stirring and movement that happens. I didn't want to disturb Ludo, but I watched him for a few moments and realized he did not appear to be breathing. Knowing sometimes ferrets can do what's called a dead sleep, where they're very still and take very slow, intermittent breaths, I didn't worry. But when I picked Ludo up, after a few moments I realized he had passed away. The necropsy showed that the previously unknown liver cyst had ruptured. The doctor said that Ludo would not have felt any pain and simply went peacefully in his sleep. I still don't quite understand what happened. The doctor said it shouldn't ordinarily rupture on its own, but would require significant pressure, such as from a fall. While Ludo was playful, he was not a climber and had not experienced anything unusual like a fall or abnormal pressure on his body. I can only imagine the antics Ludo and Skeeter are up to now that they have been reunited at the Rainbow Bridge. Look in peace, Dennis and Ludo. Your human and your siblings miss you greatly. If you'd like to share a story about a special pet, visit us at talkandtalespodcast.com or on Facebook at facebook.com/talkandtales. That's TALKINTAILS. No matter what podcast app you choose, please take a moment to rate and review the show and share it with a friend. It helps us find new listeners, which means we can bring you more stories. I also invite all of the listeners of this podcast to listen to The Adventures of Skeeter, which is available as a separate podcast. The Adventures of Skeeter is a fun, fictionalized series based on real stories from Skeeter's life, done as an old-time radio show with sound effects, humor, and a fake ad at the start of every episode, where Skeeter or one of his siblings is advertising a ferret-related product or service inspired by their actual behaviors and obsessions. You can find The Adventures of Skeeter on all major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and more. Just search for The Adventures of Skeeter.